Very warm greetings everyone. Welcome to the Introduction to Environmental Economics lecture series. Topic for today is Public Goods and Externalities. The learning objective of this lecture would be to understand the characteristics of the good, to comprehend the notion of excludability, to understand the concept of rivalry, to distinguish between the good and the bad, to understand the notion of club goods. Finally, to classify goods on the basis of characteristics. Let us start with discussing the economics. What is the characteristic or fundamental characteristic of a good? So, in economics, we define two fundamental characteristics of any good. First is excludability and second rivalry. Excludability examines whether it is possible to use prices to ration individual use of a good. Means that in case you want to value a good or exclude certain sections of the society or some people from using it, then you have to put a price on the good using the market forces. Such a characteristic and such a possibility of using prices is called as excludability. Rivalry is another aspect of any good, characteristic of a good. That has to do with whether it is desirable to ration individual use or not through the prices or any other means. So, it makes sense for the ethical value judgment, whether you are able to ration it or whether it is desirable to ration an individual's use. Let us come forward for the discussion on excludability. It is a characteristic of a good that ensures the ability to use prices to allocate a good. There are so many goods available in the market and one needs to decide how much is available for whom. So, this ethical notion or ethical question is catered by or handled by the prices. So, it is the prices which will handle the characteristic of excludability. Consumers do not consume a good unless an appropriate price has been paid. This is the regime of excludability. This characteristic of a good is referred to as excludability. Not all goods are excludable. There are certain examples of good as well as bad which have excludability and which are not. Some of them are excludable and some of them are not. Now, there are certain examples of good such as a fishery. A fishery is considered as a good, as a positive entity to consume. A fishery on a high sea, keeping the fishers away from the using of resource which is a pond or a river, which is a fishery, is very difficult and as well as expensive. To devoid certain fishers from using that open access for a fishery, it is very, very difficult. Similarly, there is another example of a bad. In bad, let us consider air pollution as an entity. Air pollution is a bad entity. Air pollution is also non-excludable. Air is of any quality. It may be of different levels of cleanliness and having a different characteristic of degree of quality or the quality, but it is in open access and all around us. Therefore, we cannot exclude certain people from consuming air pollution. If a person is in that proximity, will by default consume that air pollution. Therefore, one can frame the definition of excludability, which is a very prominent characteristic of any good or a bad, like this. A good is excludable if it is feasible and practical to selectively allow consumers to consume the good. Similarly, a definition for bad is: a bad is excludable if it is feasible and practical to selectively allow the consumers to avoid consumption of the bad. Now, to attach a price to consumption of a good or a bad, that is the main genesis of excludability. One needs to attach a price to be able to exclude the consumption. To attach a price to the consumption of a good or a bad, we have to be able to deny the consumption if the price is not paid. This is the market allocation mechanism. A person can consume if the person pays for it. This is the general theory of market mechanism. For a good such as any burger, hamburger, the right to consume that particular commodity can be denied unless you pay for it in the market. However, we have several examples that are non-excludable good as well as non-excludable bads. Let us examine certain examples which are non-excludable and they exist in our society, in the economy. One of the example is a city park, which comprises of without a fence and an entrance control, which basically means that city park is available in an open access to all. No, one cannot charge or enter into the park. One cannot keep a price for the entry of the park. It is free and open access, and no one pays for the entry. In such a scenario, how can you exclude people from entering the park? And there are social consequences and economic consequences of entering the park and littering and various other things attached with it. How can you secure that ambience? Another example, a fence or an entrance control could be added to that park, but at a huge expense. Now, the reason that you can enter, or how can you provide the limited access to this particular open access, how can you provide the limited? The only problem or the challenge is that there is a cost involved in making a fence or restriction to that entry of the park, and it is not a costless affair. Its cost could outweigh any benefit that is associated with restricting the entry to the park. So, one needs to see the cost and benefit, compare the cost and benefit. What is the benefit of not allowing the access to the park? There are definitely environmental and ecological consequences of it, but those consequences are outweighing the cost of fencing the park. This is the value judgment, and this is the economic consequence or economic judgment one has to make by weighing the costs and benefit. Suppose another example we take of non-excludability of a bad. Park was a good entity. However, we take another example which is a bad entity, and that is, suppose there is a garbage and that is considered as a bad entity. For getting rid of this garbage, it could be a local household garbage, and one needs to get rid of that. A price has to be again attached to it, this act of consumption. Either you dispose of that garbage on your own without any giving price, or somehow the disposable system has to be created to consume the garbage. What do you mean by consuming a garbage? Basically getting rid of the garbage. However, without excludability, if someone can be paid to consume this particular bag, which is a garbage, but the person can give it back to the original person. So, excludability becomes an issue in such a case. You cannot, if suppose you motivate a person that takes away your garbage, but you cannot make sure that the person will not litter around with that garbage, because there is no price unless you go for an institution that fines you with a proper fee system or fine system. There is no force for that person to actually consume or reduce the garbage. Thus, price in this case does not work. Putting a price to such a garbage system is not working because it is an ethical call from within. A person may take a price and dispose of the garbage, but still it can be disposed near your ambience or near neighborhood, which again does not solve the purpose. Garbage disposable system is something which has to be induced in the form of law or in the form of institution. Household garbage is excludable with the right number of laws on littering and trespass. It is not excludable without those laws. So, to guarantee excludability in a bad such as garbage system, one needs to look forward for right amount or right system of laws that will ensure non-littering in that area or a community. So, if some of the household trash disposal is generated and you wish to pay to dispose the garbage, then the person will leave it by the side and throw it back to the yard. How can you make or how can you ensure the behavior of the person, that the person will not act in this manner? It is only with the help of laws preventing such actions that the person will retain control of trash until someone else voluntarily agrees to take it. So, these actions and these activities which are voluntary initiated are the examples of bad, where they are non-excludable, but they can become excludable through the law enforcement or voluntary actions. Similarly, the similar kind of example can be seen in the form of air pollution. Air pollution is considered as a bad entity. Bad entity, urban air pollution is not excludable. It is not physically possible to selectively target who can consume the air pollution, because air pollution is all around the ambience. It is an ambient air pollution which has deteriorated the air quality around us. One cannot escape using it or consuming it. You cannot physically possibly selectively target only the people who will use or who will consume the air pollution. It is an open access and everybody around is consuming in a similar manner the air pollution. Everyone consumes it with the same degree also. If it were possible to selectively target who is to consume the air pollution, only those people who agree to be compensated for the pollution would consume it. This is a very important point to understand. If it were possible, there can be a case when you can exclude air pollution, certain sections of society or certain people from consuming air pollution. But these are those people who will agree to be compensated for pollution by consuming it. So people need compensation, monetary compensation. So basically you are attaching or associating a price for consumption of air pollution, which is a bad entity. If someone is not compensated, they should not consume it. So here the scenario or the framework is operating little differently as compared to the good entity. Bad entity is not to be consumed, but you are allowing consumption only with compensation. Here it will be called as compensation rather than price. It is a person who is consuming a bad entity like air pollution must be compensated enough so that he or she gets enough incentive to consume it. So people with compensation can consume it, and thus with compensation, the policymakers or the policies have made sure the selectively targeting of consumption of air pollution. Again, it is through the system of compensation and attaching price to it. If it were possible, then the two factors here that can determine excludability. Excludability, the characteristic of excludability for both bad and a good entity can be determined by two factors. One is the cost of exclusion. As we all know that there is a price which you have to attach for exclusion. So, very important factor that decides excludability or the extent of excludability is the cost of exclusion. And the other factor is the technology of exclusion and how it changes over time. There are situations in the past when the same bad or same good were considered non-excludable, but later on, with passage of time and with generations of development, the situation has turned into excludable. For example, Great Plains of Central United States. Great Plains of Central United States in the last century, it was considered as simply an open access resource, open for everyone for grazing. Since the cost of fencing that great plain was prohibitive and it was too expensive as compared to the gains from exclusion. So, using the cost benefit analysis, it was very viable that the Great Plains will not be fenced or excluded. So, in other words, prevention from overuse was not possible. So, it had become an open access in the last century. Over time, it is observed the payoffs to exclusion increased, but the technology of exclusion changed, such as invention of barbed wire, making fencing cheaper. So, slowly, gradually, the change in the technology also helps in lot of exclusion activities and making the good excludable. Even in the case of pollution, you would have heard about technology changes which lead to cleaner air. For example, the chimneys which produce less of emissions, the newly designed chimneys which create less of pollution. So, with the help of technological innovation, also one can move from non-excludability to excludability. Another example is very commonly used example is television. Television particularly that provides a particular programs that are disseminated or distributed via satellite and cable. It has been too expensive to exclude consumers from such access to such telecast. or television programs. However, with the development of low cost signal scramblers and unscramblers, exclusion became economically feasible over time, particularly for high value programs such as recent films. They are blocked from use or from watching unless a certain price is paid for them. Certain documentaries and certain programs, as well as certain telecasts which are highly valued, are become price associated with some particular price. Another example is of local parks. A local park could be excludable by building a fence around it and installing a gatekeeper, by paying a gatekeeper some basic amount of salary. One can check the and control the entry to that local park. Thus the access to the local park is controlled, and we can say local parks can become excludable. However, compared to the value generated by the park, such as costly measures of are rarely adopted. Such costly measures, when you take strict measures, then they become more expensive and costlier, like installing cameras or check guards, or even employing guards at night will become costlier. So one can ensure the restriction to the park with that amount of expense that is affordable, as well as which outweighs and where the benefits are outweighed as compared to the cost. Only then there are low cost ways of excluding, such as parking controls for parks that can be accessed only by car with exclusion exists, where exclusion will exist. So one can also start charging the parking area near the local parks. So if you want to access a local park, one needs to pay for parking. Charging the parking area near the park is nothing but making the park excludable for use. Thus, exclusion must not only be physically possible but also ensure that the given cost of exclusion is lesser than compared to the benefits. In general, the benefits involve the additional social value of having limited as opposed to the unlimited access. Once you limit the access, it means you are valuing, there is a social value attached to it. If the good is provided privately, then the benefit is the revenue that a person accumulates that can be gained by charging the admission. It is observed that environmental goods have undergone some change in excludability over the past few decades, mostly legal rather than technological changes. For example, normal household garbage system. Without institutions, garbage is not excludable, and without law against littering, garbage will simply be dumped anywhere, wherever convenient. In the times of Middle Ages in Europe, when people would throw it out even through their window onto the streets, however, the littering and creating nuisance is considered now as illegal in most of the regions. Consequently, garbage is now excludable. People can selectively choose and trade money and garbage. This is an economic transaction between trash collector and the household. We stop here and we'll come back after a short break. Thank you so much.